Barbara Waldman was 31 years old, and by every measure, life was good. She had a husband who loved her, 3 young children, a home on a quiet street in Oceanside, a suburban neighborhood on Long Island's South Shore. She was a graduate of New York University. She volunteered with the Oceanside Cancer Society. She was the kind of woman who showed up for people, not because she had to, but because that was simply who she was. Her husband Gerald, everyone called him Jerry, was a dentist. Together they were building exactly the kind of life they had planned. Their oldest child was 7, their middle child was 6, and their youngest, a little boy named Eric, had just turned 5 and had recently started kindergarten. Every day, Eric would come home at lunch, and every day, Barbara would be there. That was the routine. That was the certainty that held the family together. Nobody thought twice about it. Nobody had any reason to. January 11th, 1974 was a Friday. Jerry had left for work. The children had gone to school. Barbara was home alone. At some point that morning, someone came to her door. What happened next would not be discovered by police. It would not be discovered by a neighbor. It would be discovered by a 5-year-old boy walking home from kindergarten, expecting lunch. Eric came through the front door and called out for his mother. There was no answer. He went upstairs, and there, next to her bed, lying on the floor in her nightgown and rose-covered bathrobe, was Barbara. He was 5 years old, and the image of what he saw that afternoon would stay with him for the rest of his life. When investigators arrived at the home on Sally Lane, the scene was deeply disturbing. Barbara's hands had been tied behind her back with her own stockings. A pillowcase had been stuffed into her mouth. She had been indecently assaulted and shot once in the back of the head. The house had not been touched. Nothing had been stolen. Her purse was right where she had left it. This was not a robbery that went wrong. The house was calm and undisturbed. Whoever came through that door that morning came with a plan, and they carried it out without leaving the scene in chaos. That kind of control told investigators something important. This was deliberate. A neighbor reported seeing someone running away from the Waldman home that morning. The man was wearing a coat with a distinctive fur-lined collar. Investigators worked with the witness to produce a sketch. It was shared with the public. Tips came in. Every lead was followed. Every lead ran dry. With no clear suspect, investigators looked closely at Jerry. That is standard in cases involving a slain spouse. Jerry cooperated with everything. He answered every question. He gave investigators nothing to doubt. But with no one else to point to, a quiet suspicion settled over him in the community. People wondered. Some believed the worst. And Jerry had no way to prove them wrong, because the real answer was still out there, unknown to everyone. He would carry that weight for the rest of his life. The decades that followed were painful in ways that are hard to put into words. Jerry raised 3 children on his own. He worked. He showed up. He did everything a father was supposed to do. And he did it all while being quietly judged by people who had no idea what the truth actually was. At one point, a man in prison confessed to taking Barbara's life. Investigators took it seriously. DNA testing was done. It was not a match. Investigators also looked into a similar case from 1968 in nearby Valley Stream. Could the same person be responsible for both? DNA comparison was run. Again, not a match. Both doors closed. Years passed, then decades. Eric, the little boy who had climbed those stairs at age 5, became a man in his 50s. His sister Marla refused to give up. She studied the case herself. She pushed. She believed that whoever had walked up to her mother's door that January morning in 1974 was still out there, and that the evidence from that day still held his name. She was right. In August 2024, 50 years after Barbara's life was taken, investigators got a partial DNA hit from the evidence collected at the original crime scene. It was not a full match yet, but it was enough to start moving again. Using a process called investigative genetic genealogy, scientists cross-referenced the DNA against public ancestry databases, the kind of databases where millions of ordinary people submit their own DNA to learn about their family history. By identifying distant biological relatives in those databases, researchers can build family trees and work their way toward the person they are looking for. It takes time, it takes precision, but it works, and in this case, it led to a name. Thomas Generatio, born February 1st, 1947, a resident of Oceanside, Long Island. He had lived less than 4 miles from the Waldman home on Sally Lane. At the time of Barbara's slaying in 1974, he worked as a sanitation worker. Investigators came to believe he may have been the Waldman family's own garbage collector. He had prior arrests for assault and possession of stolen property, but his DNA had never been taken and entered into any database. He had stayed off the radar for 50 years. Then Marla did something that changed everything. Working alongside investigators, she tracked down old photographs of Generatio from around the time of the crime. She studied them carefully. In one photograph, Thomas Generatio was wearing a coat with a fur-lined collar, the exact same distinctive collar that appeared in the composite sketch from 1974, the sketch that had been sitting in the case file for half a century. The DNA, the genealogy, the interviews, and that one photograph. Together, they closed a 52-year-old case. There would be no trial. Thomas Generatio had died of cancer in 2004 at the age of 57. He had lived as a free man for 30 years after taking Barbara's life. He never faced a courtroom. He never answered for what he did. On March 11, 2026, the Nassau County Police Department announced the identification at a press conference alongside the FBI and the Nassau County District Attorney's Office. The evidence was conclusive. The case was closed. Thomas Generatio took Barbara Waldman's life. The investigation confirmed it beyond any reasonable doubt.
Jerry Waldman had passed away without ever fully knowing. He had spent decades quietly suspected by some of the very people who should have supported him. He had loved Barbara. He had raised their children. He had done nothing wrong. And now finally, the record showed that clearly. His daughter Marla stood before the cameras and said what should have been said decades earlier. She told the world that her father, Jerry Waldman, was exonerated, that he had been a victim, not a villain, that she could finally say that out loud after 52 years. Her brother Eric, now 57 years old, said simply that he had carried the image of his mother in his head since he was 5 years old, that it would not go away, that it never would. Their brother Larry said his family had been hurting for a very long time. Barbara Waldman was 31 years old. She had 3 children, a husband who loved her, and a home on a quiet street. She deserved to grow old. Her children deserved to know her, and her husband deserved to be remembered for exactly what he was, a man who lost everything in a single morning and carried it with quiet dignity for the rest of his life. She is remembered now, and so is the truth. If you are new to Darkest Crime Stories, take a second and subscribe. New cases go up regularly, and every single one of them deserves to be heard. Barbara's family waited 52 years, but on the coast of Massachusetts, another family was counting a different kind of time. A father had been carrying his daughter's photograph in his wallet every single day for 36 years, through winters, through summers, through decades that blurred into one another, waiting for the day someone would finally be held accountable. The evidence that made it possible was something the perpetrator had no idea he had left behind, and it had been sitting in an evidence locker, waiting patiently for nearly 40 years. Claire Gravel was 20 years old and full of life. She was a sophomore at Salem State College in Massachusetts, studying, working, and building the early foundations of an adult life that had every reason to go on for decades. She was not someone who went through the motions. She showed up. She cared. She worked at the National Braille Press, a job that served people who needed help. It was not glamorous work. It was not highly paid work, but she chose it. And that choice says a lot about who she was at 20 years old. Her brother James described her from the witness stand years later as fun, feisty, and friendly. 3 simple words. But they paint a picture of someone who filled a room, someone people were drawn to without entirely knowing why, someone whose absence left a hole that nothing else could fill. Her father carried her photograph in his wallet, not for a year, not for a decade, every single day, for 36 years. Through all the ordinary days and the hard ones, through every season,
He never put it away. He never stopped waiting for the answer he deserved. The evening of June 29, 1986, started like any other summer night. A softball game, friends, a pub on Washington Street in Salem called Major Maglish's, where a group of young people spent a few hours after the game. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering, or so it seemed. Claire was in good spirits. She spent the evening with friends, laughing and winding down after the game the way people do on warm summer nights. When the pub closed, she said her goodbyes. A friend gave her a ride back to her apartment on Loring Avenue in Salem. She was dropped off somewhere between 1:30 and 1:45 in the morning. Her friend watched her walk toward the building, then drove away, assuming the night was over, assuming Claire was safely home. It was the last time anyone who loved her saw her alive. That same evening, witnesses outside the pub reported seeing a young woman matching Claire's description, arguing with a man on the street. The two were seen getting into a car together. At the time, no one thought much of it. People argue, people get into cars. Life moves on, but Claire's life did not move on from that night. The following afternoon, June 30th, 1986, 3 workmen discovered a young woman's body in the woods on the side of Route 128 in Beverly, just over the Salem border. It was Claire. She had been strangled with her own black tank top. She was 20 years old. She had been there since the night before. Investigators processed the scene carefully. They collected every piece of evidence they could find, and they made a decision that day that would turn out to matter enormously. They preserved the black tank top. The item used to take Claire's life was bagged, labeled, and stored with care. The investigators who made that call could not have known exactly how important it would be one day, but they made it anyway. Witness interviews were conducted. The people who had seen Claire outside the pub gave what descriptions they could of the man she had been arguing with. A picture was slowly built, incomplete, but enough to keep the investigation moving. Investigators pushed the case as far as the technology of 1986 would allow them to go, but without a DNA match for the profile that had been developed from the tank top, the case eventually slowed. The file stayed open, but it had nowhere left to go.
The years after Claire's slaying were heavy for her family, in ways that never fully lifted. Her father did not forget. He carried her photograph through the rest of the 1980s, and all through the 1990s and into the 2000s. He carried it through decades in which the world changed almost beyond recognition, while the one question that mattered most to him stayed exactly where it had always been, unanswered. Then, in 2012, something shifted. DNA testing of the preserved black tank top produced a result. A male DNA profile developed from the genetic material left on the very item used to take Claire's life. The profile was entered into the National DNA database, and the waiting began again. A different kind of waiting this time, not the helpless kind, but the purposeful kind. Investigators now had something real to work with. They just needed a match somewhere in the system. For 12 more years, no match came. The match, when it finally arrived, came from a direction no one had anticipated back in 1986. In 2007, 21 years after Claire's life was taken, a man named John Carey attacked his neighbor, a woman named Rosemary Diskin, inside her home in Hamilton, Massachusetts. He attempted to strangle her. She survived. Carey was arrested and in 2008 was convicted of the attack. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and as required by law, his DNA was collected and entered into the national database. It matched the profile from Claire's black tank top. The man who had gone about his life for more than 2 decades, through all the years Claire's father carried her photograph and her brother learned to speak about his sister in the past tense, had left what prosecutors would later call his genetic blueprint on the very weapon he used to take her life. He had not known. He had lived freely, and for 35 years it had cost him nothing. John Carey was formally charged with Claire's slaying in 2022. By the time of his indictment, Carey was already behind bars, serving his 20-year sentence for the 2007 attack on his neighbor. The method he used in that crime, attempting to strangle a woman in her own home, was chillingly similar to what had been done to Claire Gravel 21 years earlier in Salem. Investigators who looked at both cases side by side saw a pattern that the DNA had now confirmed in legal terms. His trial opened in late February 2026. Standing before the jury, Deputy First Assistant District Attorney Kim Faitella laid it out plainly. John Carey had left his genetic blueprint on the murder weapon. The DNA match was not a coincidence.
It was not open to interpretation, one in hundreds of billions. Carey did not accept responsibility. He took the stand in his own defense and claimed that his interaction with Claire that night had been consensual. He suggested that someone else, some unnamed, unidentified person, had been responsible for what happened to her afterward. He asked the jury to believe that a 20-year-old woman found strangled with her own clothing in the woods off Route 128 had met him willingly that night and then been harmed by a complete stranger shortly after. The jury heard him out. They deliberated. They rejected every word of it. On March 3, 2026, John Carey was found guilty of first-degree slaying. He was 66 years old. On March 26, 2026, 40 years to the season after Claire walked out of a pub in Salem and never came home, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
District Attorney Paul Tucker said at the verdict what the Gravel family had waited 4 decades to hear, that the family of Claire Gravel had waited 40 long years for justice, that the wait was over. Claire's brother James had sat in that courtroom and described his sister to a jury who had never known her. Fun, feisty, and friendly. 3 words chosen not for elegance but for truth. He gave that jury a person, not just a case number. He made sure they understood exactly what had been taken on that summer night in 1986. And Claire's father, the man who had carried her photograph in his wallet every single day for 36 years, had finally reached the moment he had been waiting for. Through all those winters and summers and ordinary days that kept coming whether he wanted them to or not, he had kept her close in the only way he could. He had been right not to let go. The evidence had been waiting with him the whole time. Justice came for Claire's family after 40 years, but in Flagstaff, Arizona, a family is still waiting for their day in court. A young woman was stabbed 20 times outside her own apartment on a November night in 1987. For 38 years, no one was charged. Then, in March 2026, a grand jury returned an indictment. The man named in that indictment had been living in Arizona the entire time, and his history of violence against women had never stopped. Ina Claire Langstaff was 24 years old and exactly where she had chosen to be. She had not stumbled into her next chapter by accident, she had worked toward it. After living in Georgia and then in Phoenix with her brother and her aunt, she had made her way to Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff and enrolled as a first-semester student in the autumn of 1987. She was studying political science with a minor in French. That combination tells you something about her. She was interested in how the world worked and how people communicated across languages and cultures. She was curious. She was building something. She had plans that stretched comfortably into the future. Flagstaff sits at over 7,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by ponderosa pine forests and wide open sky. It is the kind of place that feels safe, the kind of place where a young woman starting her first semester at university should feel nothing but possibility ahead of her. Ina never made it to her second semester. November 7th, 1987, evening. Ina's apartment was on Tucson Avenue near Florence Street in Flagstaff's Old Town neighborhood. Close enough to campus to walk, quiet enough to study. A perfectly ordinary address for a first-semester student finding her footing in a new city. Nobody who knew Ina had any reason to be worried that night. There was no documented trouble in her life, no conflict, no warning signs. It was just another autumn evening in a university town. But sometime that night, outside her own front door, Ina's life was taken from her. She was stabbed 20 times in the upper torso. 20 times. That number is not incidental. It is not the result of a situation that spiraled unexpectedly. Whoever came to that apartment on Tucson Avenue that night did not arrive by accident. They came with intent. And the evidence of that intent was written 20 times across Ina Langstaff's body. Investigators responded to the scene and immediately began building a case. The work was thorough. Evidence was carefully collected and documented. DNA samples were preserved with the understanding, even in 1987, that forensic science was advancing and that what could not be tested today might be testable in the future. That foresight would matter enormously, but not for a very long time. The Flagstaff community was shaken. A violent attack on a young female student near the NAU campus was not something people could brush aside.
investigators followed every lead the case produced. They worked it hard. But DNA profiling in 1987 was still in its earliest stages in American criminal investigation. The technology that could turn the preserved evidence into a name simply did not exist yet at the level investigators needed. The evidence went into storage, the case file stayed open, and the years began to pass. For 35 years, Ina's case lived in that difficult space that so many unsolved cases occupy, not forgotten, but going nowhere. Flagstaff grew and changed around the spot on Tucson Avenue where she had lost her life. Students came and went through NAU with each academic year. Time moved forward for everyone, except the people who loved Ina and the investigators who had never officially closed her file. Ina's family, her brother, her aunt, the people who had known her in Georgia and Phoenix, and in the short weeks she had spent in Flagstaff, carried the weight of an unanswered question through all those years. Not just the grief of losing her, but the additional pain of knowing that whoever was responsible had continued their life completely uninterrupted, going to work, waking up in the morning, living freely, while Ina's family lived with nothing but questions. As forensic genetic genealogy began transforming cold case investigations across the United States in the early 2020s, cracking cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable, the Coconino County Attorney's Office began preparing to take a fresh run at the evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1987. The science had finally caught up to what that evidence contained. In 2025, the original forensic evidence from Ina's case was submitted to 2 laboratories, the Arizona Department of Public Safety's Northern Regional Crime Lab and Bodie Technology, a forensic laboratory with deep expertise in extracting usable DNA profiles from old and challenging samples. The work was painstaking, but it delivered. A DNA profile was developed, clear enough, specific enough, ready to be compared. The result pointed to a name: James Arthur Runnels Jr., 62 years old, a resident of Glendale, Arizona, at the time he was identified. Runnels had been living in Flagstaff in 1987, the same city, the same year, in the same area where Ina Langstaff lost her life outside her apartment on Tucson Avenue. That alone would have been significant. But when investigators looked at what came after 1987, the picture became even clearer. In 1990, just 3 years after Ina's slaying, Runnels entered a woman's apartment in Phoenix by asking to use her phone. Once inside, he attacked her. He stabbed her in the back and chest with a barbecue fork and cut her throat with a knife. The woman survived. Runnels was convicted. His record after that included aggravated assault, unlawful imprisonment, forgery, and criminal trespass. A man with a long and documented pattern of violence toward women. A man who had been in Flagstaff during the autumn of 1987. And now a man whose DNA connected him directly to what happened on Tucson Avenue on the night of November 7th.
On March 19, 2026, a Coconino County grand jury indicted James Arthur Runnels Jr. in connection with Ina Langstaff's slaying. He was arrested and arraigned on March 24, 2026. He pleaded not guilty. Bond was set at $1 million cash only, a number that reflected both the seriousness of the charge and the strength of the evidence behind it. The trial is still ahead. The case will be presented to a jury. The evidence that took 38 years to produce an indictment will be laid out in a Coconino County courtroom, and a verdict will eventually be delivered. Coconino County Attorney Ammon Barker stated publicly what the Langstaff family had been waiting nearly 4 decades to hear, that Ina's family had waited almost 40 years for answers, that those answers had now arrived. The public record from this stage of the case does not yet include extended family statements. The arrest is recent. The proceedings are just beginning. The family is navigating a moment that is both long overdue and entirely new territory all at once. But the weight of what Coconino County Attorney Barker said is not lost on anyone paying attention. Nearly 4 decades. That is not a figure of speech. That is 38 years of carrying a question with no answer.
38 years of watching the world move forward while justice stood still. Ina Langstaff was 24 years old. She was in her first semester at a university she had chosen for herself. She was studying subjects she genuinely cared about. She had a future that should have lasted for decades. She deserved a second semester. She deserved so much more than she was given. The indictment does not give those years back. Nothing can. But it is the beginning of the accounting that Ina and her family have been owed for a very long time. These stories stay with people, and they are meant to. If this episode has moved you, drop a comment below and tell us which case has hit you the hardest. These conversations matter. These names deserve to be spoken out loud. In Flagstaff, there is at least a name, a face behind the charges, and a trial ahead. But not every case gets that far. In Yakima, Washington, a young woman was found in the back of an abandoned truck in the summer of 1977. For 47 years, nobody knew who she was. Her brothers and sister spent decades searching for her and never stopped. In 2024, forensic science finally gave her back her name. But the person who took her life has never been identified. That part of the investigation is still open, and her family is still waiting for the second half of the answer.
Her family called her Joni. Her full name was Vereta Gates. She was born on October 21, 1952 in Vermont, the second of several children in a close family that would spend the next 47 years wondering what had happened to her. Joni was a free spirit, and that is not just a phrase, it is the most accurate description of who she was. She hitchhiked, she wandered, she moved between Vermont, New York, and the West Coast throughout the 1970s, drawn by curiosity and the desire to see what was on the other side of the next horizon. She was young, and she was alive, and she was moving through the world completely on her own terms. She was 24 years old in the summer of 1977. She had wavy, shoulder-length brown hair. She stood about 5 feet 8 inches tall. She was heading west, and less than 2 weeks before her life was taken, she had been in a hospital near Chicago, a brief stop along the way before continuing her journey. She continued west. She never arrived where she was going. For 47 years after that, the world knew her only as Yakima Jane Doe. Her brothers and sister knew her as Joni, and they never stopped looking for her. It was the smell that first drew attention. A fenced lot at the Yakima Hardware Company on South Front Street in downtown Yakima, Washington. A disabled Chevy Apache pickup truck that had been sitting in that lot, completely still, for days. An employee who noticed an odor coming from the vehicle that had no business being there. The employee reported it. Investigators responded on July 25, 1977. What they found inside the back of that truck was a young woman who had been there for at least a week, possibly 2. She wore only light-colored socks. A green sweater had been placed over the upper part of her body. Nearby, investigators found clothing, a yellow handmade dress, blue corduroy jeans, a blue shirt. On the white underwear found near her body, a name had been hand-stenciled, Scott Lilly, 2H. It was not her name. The clothing, as was common among people living on the road in the 1970s, had simply passed through other hands before reaching her. She had been struck on the head 3 times with a heavy object. She had been indecently assaulted. She had been strangled, and then she had been left in the back of an old truck in a downtown parking lot while the summer days passed around her and nobody came looking, because nobody in Yakima knew who she was. Investigators worked the case with everything they had in 1977. They catalogued her clothing and her physical description in precise detail. They circulated the information through whatever channels were available at the time. They followed the name stenciled on the underwear as a lead. It did not lead to her identity. No missing persons report matched her description. Nobody came forward to claim her. Nobody recognized her from the details investigators released to the public. Joni was buried in Tahoma Cemetery in Yakima. She was given a grave. She was not given her name. The case was entered into the records, and there it sat as the years turned into decades. The file open, the investigation stalled, the young woman in the cemetery still known only as Jane Doe. Somewhere in Vermont, her brothers and sister were looking. They were making inquiries, following whatever small leads they could find, waiting for a phone call that never came. For 47 years, it never came. The technology that would eventually bring Joni home arrived in stages, and each time, it seemed like the breakthrough that would finally deliver the answer. And each time, it stopped just short. In 2004, 27 years after her discovery, investigators made the decision to exhume Joni's remains from Tahoma Cemetery and extract a DNA sample. It was a significant commitment to a case that had been sitting untouched for nearly 3 decades. The DNA profile that was developed was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, which holds genetic profiles from millions of individuals and runs constant comparisons looking for matches. There was no match. The profile sat in the database. Mary Lee, Jeffrey, and David Gates, Joni's siblings, grew older. Their sister remained, to the rest of the world, an unnamed young woman in a cemetery in Yakima. Whatever that felt like across those years, knowing their sister was out there somewhere, unidentified, unclaimed, buried under a name that was not her own, is the kind of pain that simply does not have adequate words. They described it later as a wound that never healed. That is not an exaggeration. That is exactly what it was. In 2022, the Yakima Police Department made a decision that would change everything. They submitted forensic evidence from Joni's case to Othram, a forensic DNA laboratory based in the Woodlands, Texas, that had developed a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing. This technology is capable of building detailed, usable DNA profiles from samples that standard testing cannot fully resolve. Old samples, degraded samples, samples that have been sitting in storage for decades. Othram had been using this process to crack cold cases across the country, one after another, since the early 2020s. Yakima investigators hoped it could do the same for the young woman buried in their city's cemetery. Othram's scientists took the evidence from Yakima and used forensic-grade genome sequencing to map the DNA in extraordinary detail. That profile was then run through public ancestry databases, the same kind of databases where millions of ordinary Americans submit their own DNA to learn about their heritage and family background. The process that followed is called forensic genetic genealogy. By finding biological relatives of the unidentified person in those public databases, people who share portions of their DNA, researchers can begin building family trees. They work outward from distant relatives to closer ones, step by step, generation by generation, narrowing toward the specific person they are trying to identify. In this case, the research led to a family. A sibling of the unidentified woman appeared as a likely biological match. Contact was made. A DNA sample was requested. The sibling provided it. The comparison was run against the profile developed from the Yakima evidence. It was a confirmed match. The young woman who had been found in the back of a truck in downtown Yakima in July 1977, who had been buried without her name, whose family had spent 47 years asking where she had gone, was Vereta Gates, Joni, 24 years old, from Vermont, last known to be heading west in the summer of 1977, a few days after leaving a hospital near Chicago. Her identity was publicly announced on July 2, 2024. There is no arrest to report in Joni's case. There is no perpetrator identified. No indictment, no trial, no sentence. The person who struck her 3 times with a heavy object indecently assaulted her, strangled her, and left her in the back of an abandoned truck in the summer of 1977 has not been found. As of this episode, the Yakima Police Department has confirmed that the investigation into her slaying remains active. Any information the public can provide about who Joni may have been with in the days before her end, about anyone who remembers her presence in Yakima in July 1977, about anything at all that might open a new lead, is still being sought. One half of this mystery has been solved. After 47 years, Joni's identity has been restored, but the other half remains open, and it may remain open for a long time yet. Joni's siblings spoke when her identity was confirmed in 2024. Mary Lee, Jeffrey, and David Gates said that the identification had finally allowed some closure to come to their family after a 45-year search, that it had given them something they had been waiting for since Joni disappeared, that it had addressed a wound that had never healed. Read those words slowly. 45 years of not knowing where their sister was. 45 years of a question that had no answer. And at the end of it, not a full resolution, not a perpetrator in custody,
not a complete accounting, but at least this, a name. The world finally knowing who she was, where she came from, that there were people who had loved her and looked for her and never, in all those decades, stopped. Vereta Gates was 24 years old. She was moving through the world freely and on her own terms, the way every 24-year-old should be allowed to do. She was heading somewhere. She deserved to arrive. If anyone has information about what happened to Joni in Yakima in the summer of 1977, the Yakima Police Department is still asking for it. Her story is not finished. Sometimes the investigation can only restore a name, and even that can take 47 years. In Blount County, Tennessee, a hunter stumbled upon human remains in a wooded area in the spring of 1981. For 45 years, nobody knew who that man was. Nobody knew where he had come from, and nobody knew what had happened to him in those quiet woods south of Knoxville. In March 2026, forensic science finally gave him back his identity. But the question of how he ended up there, and whether someone was responsible, remains one of the most quietly unresolved mysteries in Tennessee to this day.
His family called him Tommy. William Thomas Green was born on March 29, 1942, in Memphis, Tennessee. He grew up there and later moved with his family to the Knoxville area, settling into the kind of life built around familiar streets, familiar faces, and the people who had known him longest. Tommy would have been around 35 years old when he disappeared. His family in Knoxville remembered him the way families remember people they love. Not through dramatic moments, but through ordinary ones. The way he talked, the way he showed up, the unremarkable, irreplaceable details of a person that only the people closest to them ever really hold on to. The last time his family saw him was sometime around November 14, 1977, in Knoxville. It was not a dramatic goodbye. There was no argument, no sign that anything was wrong. It was just an ordinary farewell, the kind that happens between people who fully expect to see each other again soon. Tommy never came back. And for 45 years, his family had no idea why. After that last contact in November 1977, Tommy Green simply vanished from the lives of everyone who knew him. There was no trail to follow, no witness who saw him leave or recorded where he was going. No documented incident that pointed investigators in any particular direction. He was there, and then he was not there. Whether Tommy left Knoxville on his own and encountered something afterward, whether something happened to him before he ever left the city, whether he met someone who meant him harm, none of those questions had answers. What was known was only the end point, a wooded area in Blount County, Tennessee. A hunter, a spring morning in 1981. On April 4, 1981, nearly 4 years after Tommy was last seen, a hunter, making his way through the East Miller's Cove area of Blount County, discovered skeletal human remains. East Miller's Cove sits in the quiet rural land south of Knoxville, where the terrain rises toward the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. It is remote, it is easy to miss, and for nearly 4 years, whatever had happened there had gone completely unnoticed. Investigators responded and began the work of establishing what they were looking at. Forensic anthropologists examined the remains and determined they belonged to a white adult male, likely between 18 and 35 years old, who had passed away sometime between 1977 and 1980. Beyond those basic parameters, the remains could tell investigators very little. There was no identification on or near the body, no clothing that provided clear answers, no missing persons report on file that lined up precisely with what they had found. The man from East Miller's Cove became known as Knoxville John Doe. He was entered into the records with the details that could be documented. Investigators tried to connect his description to anyone reported missing in the relevant time frame. Nothing definitive emerged. For 26 years, Tommy Green lay in those records as an unidentified man, unknown, unclaimed, and unconnected to the family in Knoxville who had spent those same years wondering where he had gone. In 2007, more than 2 decades after the discovery in East Miller's Cove, the University of Tennessee Forensic Anthropology Center, one of the most respected institutions of its kind in the entire country, submitted a DNA sample from the remains to the University of Texas Center for Human Identification.
A profile was developed and entered into both CODIS, the FBI's National DNA Database, and NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, which serves as the central federal database for cases exactly like this one. There was no match. The profile sat in the databases. More years passed. Tommy's family in Knoxville continued to live with the silence of a disappearance that had never been explained. They did not know that the man found in Blount County was their Tommy. They were waiting for an answer that was geographically closer to them than they could have imagined. The remains of their family member had been sitting in a Tennessee record for decades, just south of the city where they lived. Tennessee launched its Unidentified Human Remains Initiative, a dedicated program to work through the state's backlog of unidentified persons cases using the most advanced technology currently available. The Knoxville John Doe case was on that list. In March 2025, a sample from the case was submitted to Othram in Texas, the same laboratory that had identified Joni Gates in Yakima, the same forensic-grade genome sequencing process that had been restoring identities to unnamed individuals across the country, one case at a time. The research identified potential relatives of the unidentified man. A family member was contacted. A reference DNA sample was collected and compared directly against the profile developed from the Blount County remains. It was a confirmed match. The man found in East Miller's Cove on April 4, 1981, the man recorded in Tennessee files as Knoxville John Doe for 45 years, was William Thomas Green. Tommy, born in Memphis on March 29, 1942, last seen by family in Knoxville in November 1977. The identification was announced on March 17, 2026. The circumstances of Tommy's end remain under active investigation. It has not yet been formally determined whether his passing was the result of foul play or other causes. Both possibilities remain open, and investigators are still working to establish the full picture of what happened between that last family contact in November 1977 and the spring morning 4 years later, when a hunter found his remains in those woods south of Knoxville. Tommy's family now knows who the man in Blount County was. They know it was him, their Tommy, born in Memphis in 1942, last seen in Knoxville in the autumn of 1977. They know that the silence that followed his disappearance was not the silence of a man who had simply chosen to walk away from his life. He was there, in those woods in Blount County, all along, close to home, close to the people who loved him, unknown to everyone for 45 years. What they do not yet know is why. That question is still being worked on. The investigators are still pushing. The public is still being asked to help. Tommy deserves the full truth. His family has waited long enough to hear it. 5 cases, 5 families. Some of them finally have justice, a conviction delivered, a sentence handed down, a name publicly held accountable after decades of waiting. Others have half an answer, an identity confirmed, but a perpetrator still unknown, a trial still ahead, a full truth still being assembled piece by piece. And all 5 share the same reality. The people at the center of these stories were real. They were loved. And no amount of time ever changed that. Barbara Waldman was 31 years old and had 3 children who needed her. Claire Gravel was 20 years old and had a father who never once stopped carrying her photograph. Ina Langstaff was 24 and was in her first semester at a university she had chosen for herself. Joni Gates was 24 and moving freely through the world the way she had every right to do. Tommy Green was 35 and was someone's brother, someone's family, someone who was expected home and never arrived. These are the darkest stories, but they are also the most human ones, and every single one of them deserved to be told. If this episode meant something to you, a like and a subscribe helps make sure these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Every case on this channel belongs to someone who deserves to be remembered. We will see you in the next one.